Hi, so my name's Seeta Patel and I'm a Bharatanatyam trained dancer and I work in the UK and overseas. As a dancer I work as a classical soloist predominantly and I choreograph contemporary South Asian work.
You're born in London.
I was born in London and I moved to Bristol at the age of 6 and pretty much grew up and began my dance training in Bristol under Kiran Ratna. And after moving away to university, I continued with other teachers after that as well. So my journey in dance began in Bristol when I was 10 years old, and I'm afraid it wasn't so glamorous as a lifelong inspiration or desire to start. I just was offered the choice to go to a Saturday school which taught Hindi or Gujarati, Urdu, and dance was one of those things. So I quite very relaxedly said, why don't I try some dance then? And my parents were great. They're not very pushy parents, so they let me do what I want. And I started going to a Saturday school. And I guess for the first 2 years, I wasn't very serious about it. I went as regularly as I could, and then over the summer holidays, I would stop dancing for 6-7 weeks, and then after a couple of years since I started, I started to be more and more engaged with it and more excited by it as I was learning more, and especially when I started with Kiran and watched her performances with her company dance productions, and it was quite mesmerizing. And I guess from there I just wanted to train more, and I got the opportunity to perform at the temple in Diwali functions and other small shows like that, and I continued and I was in some of Kiran's productions, just as quite a junior artist at that time, and it was such a great experience, and I got to meet some great artists from India who had come to work with the company, and I got to travel around the country, and I saw a lot of Wales actually, because Kiran's company is based in Wales, so it's quite nice actually having those experiences at quite a young age. My parents were, I say supportive, but supportive by their freedom to let me go to these places without kind of worrying overly, I think, as far as I could tell. And also they weren't sort of pushy dance parents in any way whatsoever. They took me there in the car and then they picked me up and they came to watch my performances, but they were never involved on a creative or artistic level. And I guess that's been an interesting part, because I sometimes, I'm one of the only dancers I think I might be the only dancer in the family, and I look at South Indian families and everyone's sort of grown up with music and with dance and literature, and I think growing up in a Gujarati family, it was quite different, I guess, that my parents came from quite modest upbringing as well, and so I guess on a sort of usual Indian cultural level in terms of the arts, we weren't surrounded by those things. So I suppose that, I don't know, it would have been nice on some level to be surrounded by those things, but on the flip side, by not having very pushy parents, I think my enjoyment of dance grew quite naturally because I liked it, not because they wanted me to like it or they liked it. So I really value that now, I think, especially. So yeah, I began dance and became more serious and worked with Kiran in her projects, and then at the age of 18 I presented my Arangetram, well, Kiran presented my Arangetram, and I held that in Bristol because that was where home was at that time. And it was funny, I think for me, I was so awed by the concept of it, and I was so kind of overwhelmed at the thought of what it meant and what I wanted it to mean as my achievement of however many years of training. And also, I wanted everyone who had worked and helped me to be proud, especially most of all Kiran. And at one time I almost thought, I don't want to do it. I don't think I'm ready. I may never be ready for what I imagine it to be in my mind. And so trying to reach such an achievement was almost unattainable for me. So I think I went full circle and decided, well, if it's going to be unattainable forever and ever, I may as well just do it and attain what I can attain from it. So I did it, and it was one of the most amazing times of my life. I think it's so important on many levels for your relationship with your teacher and for your relationship to the dance, and your parents have supported you that whole time. It's such a special occasion. It's a truly special occasion. Lots of family came, and there was food, and people gave gifts, which I totally wasn't expecting. And I'd been to maybe one or two other Arangetrams in my life, and so I didn't realize now. Obviously, I know I've been to quite a lot more, and especially within Tamil culture, and Sri Lankan culture, it's really such a huge ceremony. And mine didn't have that ceremony, but it was still a special occasion. And my grandmother watched me dance for the first time at that performance. And it was just, I wasn't perfect, I'm sure, I know. And I've grown in dance so much more. And as a dancer as I was then, it was what it was. I'm not going to say whether it was awful or it was great or anything in between. It was what it was. And I'm really happy I did it, because it did mean a lot on a lot of other levels. And as I'm frequently told, and as I frequently tell people I teach, it's the beginning of your journey, not the end. So,
how did you prepare for it?
At the time I was in my first year at university, so I'd had a big move. Obviously, I moved from Bristol to Nottingham, and so travelling up and down was took a lot of time. And I would come home every weekend leading up to the performance. I'd obviously worked during the summer before. My Arangetram was in October, and I'd worked the summer before with Kiran. Then I moved to university, travelled up and down, and in the few weeks leading up to it, the musicians were there. So I worked with the musicians for the first time, and it's quite my first time working as a soloist with musicians. And so it's quite scary for me, because just for all the reasons, you don't want to be awful, and you don't want to make mistakes, and you don't want to look incompetent, and that you shouldn't be doing your Arangetram, and all of those things. But their musicians were very, very, very sweet and really supportive. And then the day just arrived before you knew it. In fact, when we were sending out the invitations, I hand decorated every single envelope, and the programs I painted and cut them. So my creative stamp was on that level too. I thought it was just a nice small touch, and when you've got some time on your hands, it's quite a nice thing. I'm sure I wouldn't be able to do it now, but yeah, that's quite nice.
Where did you perform it?
Performed it at the Queen Elizabeth Hall Theatre in Bristol, which is part of the school. Small theatre. I think it's at about 150 people. Just as a bit like a studio theatre in a sort of 50 pence piece shape. So an unusual type of stage, but a really nice space. And it rained and rained and rained on that day, and I really didn't think anyone would come. And it started late because people were struggling to get there. But in the end, they all got there, and everyone really seemed to enjoy it.
Physically, how did you prepare for it?
Physically, as I said, I was just going to class and practicing the work with my teacher. I think at that stage, in comparison to how I work now, is pretty different. It's quite a world apart. And so the way I prepare and the way my body functions and feels now is, I think, much more sophisticated. I think when you're a bit younger, or when you're earlier in your dance career, that thinking is, for me, it was quite different, and it was just about getting through it and dancing it and remembering it and practicing it. And maybe not being so cerebral about it.
And what about the presentation?
The performance?
Jewellery and
The jewellery,
costumes
well,
and-
I mean, I'd performed numerous times before that, so I was quite happy getting myself ready, and I prepared myself mostly at home in the in the traditional costume with all the jewellery and everything, and then was driven to the venue and finished my last preparation there. So it's no different to any not. In fact, many levels that wasn't the exciting part. The exciting part was doing a full show and with working with the musicians, and I think.
And you decided then, after that, to leave your academic studies?
No, I didn't.
Oh, you didn't?
It was much later. In fact, sadly, straight after my Arangetram, I think with the excitement of your first year at university and a new course and meeting all those new people, as soon as I finished my Arangetram, I kind of slipped out of dance. Not slipped out of it, as in I didn't stop completely, but I wasn't going so regularly. My teacher obviously was much further away from me than when I was living in Bristol. So with all of those things, I naturally sort of kept it on the back burner a little bit. There wasn't enough of me to go around really, and I wouldn't say it was an active choice. It's just something that happens, I think, when you get really busy and engaged with something new and exciting like university. And so it's slowed down for a bit, but then a few years into my course, I was still working. I was doing work in Birmingham at Sumpuds with productions here and there and performances, and working with Chitralekha Bola, and my dancing hadn't stopped. I think I sat my grade 4 ISTD exam somewhere in the middle of that. And I guess a few years into that, and then I was doing a workshop in Birmingham for something they had organised, and they had brought Maven in to teach that workshop and choreograph a small piece for a group of us. And there began my relationship with working with Maven. So it started off very much as a workshop, masterclass type of workshop, and then a performance. And I can't remember the time frame really, but I got a little while later, sometime later, I got a phone call saying that he was starting a company. Would I like to join it? And it was at a funny time in my work because I was in the middle of my dissertation in the 3rd year or something like that, and it would have been crazy to leave medicine at that point because I wouldn't have even gotten a degree for 3 years of 2.5 years of really hard work. So I didn't say yes immediately, but then things went around in my mind and I decided to take a sabbatical from university. Which they gave me. So after 3 years of med school and a bachelor's degree in medical sciences, I took a break in the course, which was a natural break. Some people do, but mostly they continue on. So I took a break saying I'll come back in a year and continue my course. So I was in Maven's company for a year, and it was an intense and incredible experience, especially not coming from that sort of professional dance world, and especially not coming from that contemporary professional dance world, which is actually in another world anyway. Even if you're a professional dancer in the Indian world, I think the contemporary dance world is quite a turn of events anyway. So the end of that year came, and I think by that point I wasn't 100% sure, but I was pretty sure I wanted to do the following year at the company. And so I went back to my university and I said, can I take a 2nd year sabbatical? And they said, you can, but you can't take any more sabbaticals after this. If you don't come back, that's the end. So they very kindly gave me a 2nd sabbatical, at which point I continued with the 2nd season of Maven's company, touring and working with a new set of people. And I think I just knew at that point I wasn't going to go back. but I didn't have to make any hard and fast decisions until it was time for me to go back. And so when it was time for me to go back, I let them know, I let my parents know, and that was it.
Now, I remember seeing you in a solo performance at the Sherwood when Academy presented you. So how did that fit in to this trajectory?
Well, so where have we reached? At that point of having worked with Maven for 2 years now, and then decided not to go back to med school, Maven wasn't continuing that type of group ensemble work with that particular group of people after that point. And so I was then, at that point, preparing. I received my Lisa Ullman scholarship to go to India and study. I received my first Arts Council funding to get someone to create a new work on me, which was the solo at the Sherwood, that was presented at the Sherwood and then later at the Opera House and in Birmingham at the Mac. And there, I guess, so I started shifting my focus onto having experience in working with other choreographers who are going to work on me to create solo work on me, which I would then be able to present. I wasn't looking at choreography and I wasn't looking at ensemble work. So I went down that route and I worked Maven and Chitrasundaram choreographed that work, and it got shown to a few places. It was my first Arts Council application, successful, and I guess things sort of go and build from things in that sense. Yeah, you build relationships with places and audiences, and yeah,
so the concept of the Arangetram and the concept of your solo performance, how similar or dissimilar were they?
For me, they were pretty dissimilar, because the Arangetram is, as I said, it's much more complex, I think. Yeah, it's much more of a, can't really describe it. I suppose it's the culmination of such a long journey and such an intense relationship with your teacher over a long time. And I think when you're doing work on a commercial level, that time is obviously less that you work on something. It's not going to be 10 or 15 years worth of work on one show. And so there's that aspect. There's also the aspect that it's your, I suppose, as I said, anything commercial, even if you're doing it for very less money, or even if you're doing it out of the love of it, if it is on a commercial level and it's about you presenting yourself to audiences who are paying tickets to come and see, it's always going to be a different process. And you're always going to want something different out of it. It's not just about making people you love happy, it's about making strangers engaged and happy and interested enough to come and see you again. And so I think it's apples and oranges. The two aren't the same at all. And yeah, I think that only an experience when, like an Arangetram, and some years later, in fact, just last year, I presented my first solo classical evening with music at the Royal Opera House in London, here, under the guidance of Maven. And actually that was a culmination of like 8 or 10 years of our relationship together as student and teacher and boss and friends. And so that was more, even though that was a commercial event, that was more like more similar to my Arangetram, in the sense of feeling of achievement and feeling of the culmination of a long journey and the beginning of the next part of it.
So what was the difference between the content of your Arangetram and the content of the classical solo performance?
I mean, that performance at the Opera House, the idea was to present a repertoire of work but the way Maven had conceived it was much more sensitive to, I guess, an environment like the Opera House and an environment where people are paying to see. And so it doesn't have necessarily the ceremony that is attached to an Arangetram, and it doesn't have as many costume changes, and there's no food afterwards, and there are no thanks at the end in terms of gifts. But I think the nuts and bolts of it are actually very similar, and the content is different in as much as two different people choreographed it, and two different artists' minds and hearts went into it. Even though I'm the same person who danced both works, I'm 10 years apart, so I may as well be a different person.
What I'm gathering from you is that the Arangetrams was much more of a social event.
Not at all. No. Not at all. Not in the slightest. It is a celebration, but I think in the different way to a birthday party or I don't know, any other sort of party, there's a real reverence given to what it is you're doing and why everyone has come there together. And that's because of your dancing, and that's because of all the work that you and other people have put into making that day happen. And so it isn't a ceremony that happens all the time. It's hopefully just, and probably just, a one-off in your lifetime. And I don't think I would consider it a social event. I think that wouldn't be the right thing. I'm not sure I meant to say it in a way that made people think that, but it's definitely something for loved ones to come to.
Because you're talking about the food and the presents.
No, I mean, none of those. The food was because people have come from far, and, you know, I don't know, that's not the main event. It's 10 minutes of a 2-hour evening. It's not really the point of it. And I wasn't expecting gifts. I suppose people wanted to bring gifts. I don't know if that's normal or not, but that was definitely not something that was ever on my mind. It was always about the dance. And if you think about the amount of work and the amount of time of the evening which is dedicated to that, then I think it's quite different to it's like comparing, I don't know, I suppose a birthday party with a 5-minute speech. It's not all about the speech, it's about the party. And the same with this, it's not all about the food, it's about the dance. So other things could have not been there and it would have been fine. So it's not a social gathering in that sense.
So how do you see your future in dance?
I don't know. I cannot answer that question in the slightest, because you never really know.
Because it seems to me that you wait for things to happen organically as opposed to planning.
No, there's a lot of planning that goes on, but I think more than planning, there's a lot of hard work that goes on. And so I keep my training going, and I very much try and continue having that relationship with my teachers, which is really important. And I also teach, so that's also part of my growing. And a lot of planning, almost too much planning, has to be involved to make things keep moving on. For you to find the time in your work and practice to continue with your teachers, to find time in your work and practice to develop your own artistic voice separate from your teachers, and to spend all the time to be a part of the business aspect of it, which is not something we all want to do, but we have to, otherwise we can't make a living in this profession. So some of it is organic and some of it is luck, but a lot of it is just pure, simple hard work.